Welcome back to today's episode of Wiley Ryan's Government Contracts podcast. I'm your host, Craig Smith, here with my co-host, Brian Walsh. And today, Brian, as I was getting ready for our guest today, I found that my playlist that I was listening to kept drifting to Missy Elliott, Pharrell, Timbaland and Magoo, somebody featuring Timbaland, late Pharrell, Neptunes even. And it hit me, I mean, you and I were about the same age.
Yep.
And it's that Tidewater music, the Pantheon. And when you think about that era of 97 to 2005 music, you think about not just those people, but today's guest, a native son of Virginia Beach, Kevin Muhlendorf, our partner in the White Collar and Government Investigations Group. Kevin, how are you doing?
Good. Glad to be here.
So Kevin, your experience is just, I think, fascinating and is going to make for a fun conversation today. You've spent time as a SEC lawyer in enforcement. You did enforcement with the Department of Justice and the Securities and Financial Fraud Unit. You've been teaching for 7 or 8 years at this point at Georgetown, and even had a really interesting position temporarily as the acting inspector general for WMATA, for those outside the DC area, the organization that runs Metro Bus and Metro Rail.
Tri-state compact.
Except DC's not a state, my friend.
Well, touche.
Okay. So Kevin, we wanted to talk about a couple things that are in your area of expertise that we want our government contracts clients to be thinking about, because normally they might think, oh, a securities lawyer. I mean, what does that have to do with government contracts today? And I think the first question is, when it comes to compliance from an SEC perspective, one term I hear is sometimes you'll see CCEP, or I think that's Certified Compliance and Ethics Professional. Maybe you could talk a little bit about why is that important to pay attention to for contractors in particular and companies in general?
Sure. And thanks for having me. I'm excited to do this. Yeah. So I've managed, while I've been here, to acquire both a certified fraud examiner and certified compliance and ethics professional designation. They're both important for people who do the sort of things we do, which is investigate fraud schemes, but also advise government contractors on their compliance programs. And recently, I've heard from SDOs that one of the things that they like to hear when they're looking at a compliance program, if they're examining whether someone's a presently responsible contractor, is what sort of background and training do your compliance officers have internally in the compliance program, whether you have a chief compliance officer or not, and is it right size, and are you doing the right things to make sure that you as a government contractor are a good corporate citizen? Part of that is to have the right people in place, and some of that can be having a CCEP person there, but that's not obviously necessary, but it is certainly something that's helpful.
And so, Kevin, one thing, there's been a lot of press about DOJ's whistleblower program. And I think for a lot of folks who are in the government contract space, you might say, well, we've had the mandatory disclosure rule for going on 15 years now. Where does this fit into the puzzle, and where does that fit into just not only the disclosure, but the overall compliance picture?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And I think it can be kind of confusing for people who are very focused on the FAR and mandatory disclosure. SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, where I was at one point, the CFTC that handles commodities, and the Department of Justice now have these whistleblower award programs. And they're different than the mandatory disclosure, where we think we are always worried in the mandatory disclosure world, the government contracts world, about False Claims Act and that type of whistleblower. Here with the DOJ program, which I'll talk about the details a little bit, and the other two programs, the SEC and the CFTC, what you have is you have someone who can just go to the agency and say, hey, bad stuff's happening, some sort of fraud, some sort of accounting fraud. DOJ is focused on FCPA and money laundering. And there's no lawsuit that's filed like a False Claims Act relator. It's just this person relaying this information and getting a payout if the government brings a successful enforcement action, which often is a settlement. So there's really never any litigation in this space.
So is the idea I think there's a self-disclosure component to it too. So is that in a similar vein to mandatory disclosure, trying to get ahead of it?
Yeah. So one of the things that's important if you are representing an entity, and the incentive the government is trying to create is for the whistleblowers to go and report on the impropriety. But from the company's point of view, you have this incentive to self-disclose. DOJ's put it this way. We're in their program. If you come to us within 120 days of the whistleblower internally reporting, you're still eligible for a declination.
But part of that, I mean, it sounds like the key there is having a kind of a program internally that whistleblowers are willing to and feel comfortable, which is something I feel like we tell our clients all the time. Effective internal reporting is critical.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point because that brings it full circle to the CCEP point, right? Is that having a part of any compliance program is having a program set up so that people can bring concerns, problems, whatever, to the company, to the right people in the company, and so the company can handle it appropriately. And the whole point here is if you do have a program like that in place so that employees are comfortable, they can do it confidentially, there are mechanisms in place so that they are protected as internal whistleblowers or internal complainants, that's going to give you as the company the chance to do the investigation you need to do to decide whether you want to do a self-disclosure. And when SDOs or the Department of Justice or the SEC looks at these programs to decide whether you have a good compliance program, that's a critical component, is do you have this thing in place where whistleblowers are protected and it's handled properly?
And along those lines, obviously having a whistleblower program or a system where you actually respond to complaints is important, because we've known companies in the past that set something up and then it goes into the
off into the ether.
And that's why we always stress it's not just important setting it up, it's actually using it and following through with it. And therefore, sometimes whistleblowers actually know that you're listening. That cuts down on maybe a key tam or something along those lines. But putting that aside, go back to your other point, the SEC. As our longtime listeners know, my wife also currently works at the SEC, has for many years, and this is my mandatory plug for my awesome wife working at the SEC. But that's why I care about the SEC. Why should public or private government contractors care about the SEC and DOJ and their focus on accounting issues right now in government contracts?
Yeah, I'll put it in two ways. One, just to finish up what we were talking about, the SEC has been extremely focused on whistleblower protection, so for both public and private entities. So whether you're a public company or a private entity, the SEC is very much into bringing independent actions. We had a client alert out about this just recently, for if you have a confidentiality agreement or some sort of employment agreement that restricts an employee's ability to go to the government. DOJ says they're going to do this too, but SEC has been really aggressive with this. Okay, so that's one reason why people in private or public should care about what the SEC thinks. But from an accounting point of view, I mean, this is something that's been really sort of interesting in y'all's space. And Craig, you and I have worked on some of this together. It is the SEC and DOJ, frankly, because there's been some criminal action, has started looking at how construction contracts, how government contractors are accounting for both their bids and how they're doing their projects. And if you're a public company, they're saying, well, wait a second, you were overly aggressive in the way you're recording these change orders, or overly aggressive in how you bid the project. And we're going to second guess that. And if we decide that you reported it improperly, we might charge you with securities fraud. And it's a real risk. Just the other day, there was a case that a military contractor settled, and there were criminal charges related to this very issue. And so it's a real issue, and it sort of goes to the SEC getting very aggressive with the way accounting is done in public companies. And then where it rolls up to private companies, Brian, to answer your question there is, often, obviously, the SEC doesn't have sort of primary jurisdiction over private entities. But as in the whistleblower space, they have jurisdiction over whatever they think they have jurisdiction over. So they will bring actions against, say, a private company or an individual or private company that's part of a securities fraud scheme. So, for example, if you are a sub and somehow you are involved in a scheme to monkey with a public company's accounting, you're going to get wrapped up in that. And so it's really important that the data you're providing to your public company partner is accurate, because you can be part of a securities fraud action.
And I also think, looking at the current government contracts climate, that there's some companies today that are private that tomorrow might not be, because they're owned by PE or VC funds, and at some point they might get spun off and become public entities. And then all of a sudden, the more you're aware of this and the more you're able to account for it and be prepared for it now, then that might be a less painful transition down the line.
Or Brian, we've dealt with where a company maybe isn't as aggressive as in estimating cost growth as they should be, and it ends up being an issue after a transaction closes.
Yeah. And on your PE point, that's actually a really good point, Brian, because the other problem is, think of stock, people on the stock market, that sort of being a public company, but private equity or other types of investment vehicles where they may own a private government contractor, and those numbers are rolling up into a securities offering. And you may not know that's what's going on when you're at the private company creating the numbers. But if those numbers are fake and you do that to help yourself and it gets into some sort of securities offering, you have no idea that's going to happen. That can be a real problem. The other thing that's really sort of where we've seen this too is, and Craig, you and I dealt with this, is the sort of the certifications and the subcerts that executives at government contractors file They say, okay, well, my division, there's no fraud and the accounting's accurate and everything. Making sure that you have something you can point to when the government comes calling, because that's been a real problem.
Well, it reminds me of the reps and certs that companies complete, where you just go, why do I need to make this representation or certification? It's that extra hook. So you should be accurate with or without the rep and cert, or for individuals, the certifications on the accounting front. But it just adds, I think, another layer of here's why we really should pay attention to this. And Kevin, the other thing I think we took away from our matter is the importance of change management. And projecting costs or projecting revenues, there's inherent uncertainty in it. But whether it's being able to recover from a traditional government contracts litigation perspective or compliance from your seat, Kevin, I mean, being able to explain how you did and why you did it years after the fact just takes on that much more importance if the SEC is really starting to pay attention to these.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we found really sort of frustrating was, look, the SEC, they have a lot of accountants there and they do a lot of accounting cases, but they don't necessarily understand this field. And so getting them to understand that this was sort of normal in the industry and the accounting was the way it should have been was a really tough slog. And I think your point, Craig, having that data and having that backup ready at the time and contemporaneously goes a long way, rather than hiring an expert after the fact and saying, no, this is okay. So you have to think through that sort of at the time. I think that's the best way to look at it.
Well, before we get to our next question, we're going to pause to read a message from our sponsor. The White Collar Group didn't renew the sponsorship they didn't know they had. So today's episode is brought to you by the Cost Accounting Standards. CAS. If you thought financial accounting wasn't enough compliance, add CAS to the mix.
I'm excited about CAS. And I'd also like to note for those keeping score at home that I am up 1-0 and the guest saying you made a really good point over Craig Smith. That is 1-0 and we're through episode number 2 here. So that's just important. And I think we need to keep a running tally of that throughout this season and hopefully for many seasons to come. And thank you to CAS for sponsoring us. They are very, very precise in their contract language and how much they paid for the sponsorship. Kevin, we talked about the compliance and obviously SEC. What's next for DOJ and SEC in these areas?
Yeah, so I think there's probably a couple areas I wanted to talk about. One that I think is, again, it's interesting because government contractors already have these rules in place is cyber, right? The SEC, to the consternation of a lot of people, there was a lot of commentary on this, has finally rolled out recently their cyber breach disclosure rules. And the long and short of it is you have to disclose within 4 days of your determining that something, a breach is material, you have to disclose that. But that's different than the standards that the federal government has set in other places, and it's causing a lot of problems. Right now, the SEC is complaining that they're getting too many disclosures. I mean, come on. You can't have it both ways.
Yep.
So another area that I think actually things have changed since we started talking about doing this podcast. It's sort of interesting. I was going to talk about ESG, right? Because the SEC has made this big climate push and they stood up an ESG task force. Well, it turns out they've now stood down their ESG task force. So we're not exactly sure what that means. But what I can tell you is at the same time that rumors are that they've stood down the ESG task force, they just brought an ESG case. So I don't know exactly what to make of it. But what's interesting there is, they just settled a case with a maker of coffee products, let's say. And this maker of coffee products was saying that their devices that you would put in the machine to make the coffee are recyclable. And it turns out that maybe they're not as recyclable as was advertised. And is that an ESG case? Maybe it's sort of environmentally related, but what it really is, they called it a disclosure case, an accounting disclosure case, which is sort of an interesting way to phrase it. But that's sort of the vehicle the SEC has been using for everything now. Everything is now an accounting disclosure case. And they tried that in the data breach case and it didn't work. They said, no, that wasn't an internal controls problem. But here the company settled and so they agreed to take that charge.
And we've talked about AI washing is another area where you could see similar types of enforcement actions in the future.
Yeah, and sort of greenwashing is certainly a real thing.
Again, maybe a bad analogy, but it reminds me of the grand jury could indict a ham sandwich. It feels like that the SEC, the way it interprets its power is it could bring an action against anyone based on the amount of scope it believes it has.
Well, and what that really leads to is to turn it back to a compliance discussion, right? If on the front end you're gathering up the data to back up the statements you're making, then you're going to be able to very quickly put these things to bed. Even if you're not ultimately charged by the SEC, these investigations are extremely intrusive and extremely expensive. And so the better data you're creating at the time and keeping records of to back up the statements you make publicly, that's really going to help you out. And that's where having the right compliance infrastructure in place is really helpful.
Well, Kevin, I mean, those are just a couple areas where it seems like the SEC is broadening enforcement, and you can see the path. Our listeners are really focused on government contracts. Anything else you wanted to cover today? I think maybe some insider trading.
Yeah, that's always been a staple of SEC enforcement activity. And a couple things really I just thought were worth pointing out is it's the end of September is their big month. It's when they bring all their cases, right? Because they have the end of their fiscal year and they want to get their numbers up. And one case that jumped out at me the other day that was a $16,000 insider trading case. And you say to yourself, why is the SEC bothering with $16,000 insider trading cases? And the reason is because, to Brian's point earlier, because they can. And this case it's a good insider trading case in the sense of it happened. But the takeaways from this are a couple things. This was a case where an individual who was never charged took home confidential information, and the person that they were in a relationship with saw the deal information in the house and used it and tipped some friends. Some people went to jail for this. This person this latest case, the $16,000 case, was just someone down the line who traded on this material non-public information about a deal. And you can see this situation happening in a smaller government contracts case, right? So two smaller government contracts are merging, or one's being acquired by a larger one. That might be something, and it's really dangerous. And you can see that $16,000, you don't have to make a lot of money to both ruin your career and also have to spend a lot on legal fees. Similarly, in an insider trading context, and this is really new sort of breaking law in the SEC world, is this concept of shadow trading. And so it was a case that was brought, I think it was a drug context, but again, you could see it happening in a sort of defense contract context. Let's say that a contractor gets awarded a big contract to build some piece of military equipment, and there's a bunch of companies that also get the contract, and you know that because you work there. And so instead of buying stock in your company, you buy stock in a competitor. Well, that's essentially what this shadow trading was. And the court, they lost at trial, and the court just rejected the motion for a new trial, because the fact is this person who they charged, as the SEC alleged and as the court found and the jury found, used material non-public information, this confidential information of their employer. They misappropriated it. It was a misappropriation theory to trade in someone else's stock. And so the fact that it could be a non-public company, right? You could be an employee at a non-public company, but have information about a public company by virtue of the confidential information you get is from your employer, and be guilty of insider trading.
I mean, you think about all people who are in strategy or capture or even performance, the access to information they have, even before you consider companies that do advisory and assistance service or technical assistance or budget management to the government. I think this is an important lesson. It reminds me of our advice always. If you get an email that says close hold, it's probably information you want to pause before acting on. I think this is another great example, Kevin.
Yeah, and this is another area where I think we could always beef up compliance. And it's as much beefing up compliance as reminding. People just aren't thinking about this and aren't loose lips sink ships. And you just have to be really careful when you're entrusted with confidential information.
I think that's basic, but at the same time, it's a message that companies have to keep reminding people of again and again.
And I think we really come full circle here, because I know earlier you were talking about Missy Elliott, and I remember once reading that Wu-Tang shadow boxing was actually going to be called shadow trading, but then they ended up calling it shadow boxing instead of shadow trading. So I just can't really believe how that came so full circle during this podcast today.
That's a fact I did not know, and look forward to finding out if it's real.
I wouldn't Google that.
It's a deal. Well, Kevin Muhlendorf, thank you so much for joining today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
All right. Thanks for having me.
This has been an episode of Wiley Ryan's Government Contracts Podcast, a production of Wiley Ryan LLP at www.wiley.law. The Wiley Ryan Government Contracts Podcast is executive produced by Tracy Howard and is available on Spotify, Apple, and the Wiley Ryan website. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.